On a frost-covered morning in November 1944, a German anti-tank gunner positioned near Bergaltroff, France, found himself confronting a reality that shattered everything he had been taught. Through his gun sight, he watched American Sherman tanks advance through the mist on November 19th. His unit had engaged these particular American forces for 3 consecutive days, and what he witnessed contradicted every lesson from Nazi racial instructors. Despite sustaining multiple direct hits and trailing smoke from visible damage, the lead Sherman pressed forward. The tank commander remained exposed in the turret, operating the .50 caliber machine gun despite imminent danger. The gunner, whose name was Schmidt, observed an unmistakably black soldier leading the assault. Decades would pass before historians identified this man as Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. Rivers had sustained a devastating wound days earlier, his leg torn to the bone. He turned down morphine injections, rejected evacuation orders, assumed command of a replacement tank, and led his company's advance into Gebling on the following day. With a gangrenous wound that should have rendered any combatant unable to fight, Rivers continued operations for 3 full days. Schmidt would carry the memory of Rivers' final moments for the remainder of his life. The impact on him came not from the combat violence itself, but from witnessing courage that exceeded anything he had observed throughout 5 years of warfare. The soldiers his instructors had labelled inferior displayed valour beyond his experience. Nazi racial ideology met its complete refutation on the battlefield when the 761st Tank Battalion entered World War II. The battalion adopted the motto, "Come out fighting," which proved prophetic from their initial engagement at Morville-le-Vicq, Belgium, in November 1944, continuing through intensive combat until the war's conclusion. For the men of the 761st, their motto carried dual significance that German forces would comprehend in the most direct manner possible. Wehrmacht units preparing to face them included soldiers indoctrinated from childhood in beliefs of racial superiority. German military training materials explicitly stated that black soldiers lacked the capacity to operate complex machinery, possessed no courage, and would retreat upon first contact with enemy forces. These weren't casual prejudices, but foundational beliefs that informed German military doctrine and shaped tactical expectations. Over 183 consecutive days of combat, the 761st would systematically demolish every single assumption. The War Department constituted the unit on March 15, 1942, with activation following on April 1, 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Activation resulted not from progressive military philosophy, but from what internal documents termed political necessity to maintain Negro morale. Unlike any white unit, the battalion faced an unusual path toward combat deployment. Training extended for nearly 2 years, while the men watched white units deploy overseas after significantly shorter preparation periods. White armoured battalions shipped out after 12 to 16 weeks of training, while the 761 would spend over 2 years mastering armoured warfare. Every soldier understood that any mistake would reflect not on the individual, but on their entire race. Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, the white officer commanding the battalion, accepted a position considered career suicide. Bates brought experience from World War I, where he had witnessed French colonial troops demonstrate distinction in combat. More critically, he evaluated men based on capability rather than skin colour. After 2 years of preparation, his assessment held that the 761st represented the best-trained tank battalion in the United States Army. The men who would validate his judgment included Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers from Hotulka, Oklahoma. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, Rivers had grown up working a farm and possessed what Bates described as an intuitive grasp of terrain and tactics. Warren G. H. Creasy would earn recognition as the Iron Man for his exceptional endurance in combat conditions. The battalion's most famous member never saw combat. First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson faced an incident at Fort Hood, Texas, in July 1944 when he refused to move to the rear of a segregated military bus. This confrontation cost him his chance to deploy with the unit. The athlete would later become one of baseball's greatest players. Following 2 years of training in Texas, the battalion received deployment orders on June 9, 1944, 3 days after D-Day landings commenced in Normandy. The British trooper Esperance Bay carried them across the Atlantic, with arrival in England occurring on September 8, 1944. After brief deployment in England, they landed via Omaha Beach in France on October 10, 1944. Immediate attachment to General George S. Patton's Third Army followed. Patton's initial skepticism regarding black tankers was well documented through correspondence to his wife, expressing doubts about their capacity for rapid thinking required in armoured warfare. On October 28, 1944, Patton addressed the battalion with his now famous speech. He told the assembled men that they were the first Negro tankers to fight in the American Army. He stated he would never have requested them if they weren't exceptional, as he maintained only the finest units in his army. He declared indifference to skin colour as long as they advanced and killed the enemy. He emphasised that all eyes were watching them, with great expectations for their performance. The Black Panthers received their opportunity on November 7, 1944, attacking the German-held town of Morville-le-Vicq in support of the 26th Infantry Division. German defenders, comprising Wehrmacht infantry and anti-tank units, anticipated easy victory against troops they believed were America's inferior forces. The engagement lasted 4 hours. Inside the town, a German Panzerfaust knocked out the lead tank. 2 of the crew sustained wounds. Their comrades pulled them to safety behind the disabled vehicle before eliminating the soldier who fired the Panzerfaust. German after-action reports, later discovered in military archives, recorded surprise at the exceptional tactical proficiency demonstrated by the attacking tank unit. They had anticipated panic when the first tank suffered damage. Instead, the 761st executed coordinated assault tactics that systematically neutralized German positions. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers encountered a German roadblock during the assault. Under intense enemy small arms fire, he dismounted from his Sherman, attached a cable from his tank to the obstacle, remounted, and had his tank physically remove the roadblock from the road. This action allowed the tank column to resume its advance and capture the town. Rivers received the Silver Star for this action, the first of numerous decorations the battalion would earn. November 1944 saw the unit in constant combat operations. The 761st endured 183 days of continuous operational employment. November 1944. Casualties totaled 156 men, including 24 killed, 81 wounded, and 44 non-battle losses. The unit lost 14 tanks permanently, and another 20 suffered combat damage. These statistics fail to capture what German forces were learning. The black tankers they had been assured would flee at first contact instead maintained an operational tempo exceeding most white American units. While typical tank battalions rotated to rear areas after 10 to 14 days of combat, the 761 remained on the front lines continuously. German intelligence reports from this period, housed in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, began showing confusion regarding the identity of these tankers. A report from the 11th Panzer Division noted that an enemy tank unit operating in Sector 7 displayed exceptional vehicle maintenance and aggressive tactics inconsistent with intelligence assessments. The most dramatic demonstration of the battalion's determination occurred during the assault on Gebling. On November 16, 1944, during the advance toward Gebling, France, Rivers' tank struck a mine at a railroad crossing. Though severely wounded with his leg slashed to the bone, Rivers declined morphine, refused evacuation, took command of another tank, and advanced with his company into Gebling the next day. Captain David Williams, Rivers' company commander, repeatedly ordered evacuation. Rivers' documented response stated that Williams knew better than to expect that the situation would be difficult, and that another 2 days wouldn't matter. A medic examining Rivers' swollen and infected leg shouted that gangrene had set in. Williams only managed to say "Reuben" before German guns zeroed in, forcing American forces to seek cover. Dawn arrived on November 19, 1944, bringing the end. Company A's tanks advanced toward Bergelstroff that morning, but encountered enemy fire that halted their progress. Captain David J. Williams ordered his tanks to withdraw and take cover. Rivers radioed that he had spotted the German anti-tank positions. His transmission stated he could see them and would engage them. Rivers, joined by another Company A tank, opened fire on enemy tanks while providing covering fire for Company A's withdrawal. During this action, enemy fire struck Rivers' tank, killing him and wounding the remaining crew. Williams immediately submitted Rivers for the Medal of Honor, though action on the recommendation would require 52 years. December 16, 1944, brought the Wehrmacht's final major offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to Americans as the Battle of the Bulge. The battalion received attachment to the 87th Infantry Division and deployment into desperate fighting to halt the German breakthrough. They faced some of Germany's finest remaining units, including elements of the Führer-Begleit Brigade, an elite formation expanded from Hitler's personal escort battalion. Fighting around Tillet, Belgium, proved particularly brutal. Adequate replacements were difficult to obtain, and many new men assigned to join the Black Panthers arrived raw and untrained, or as rejects from other units, totally unfit for duty. Despite inadequate replacements, the 761st continued fighting. The fighting was brutal, requiring the 761st Tank Battalion Shermans and 87th Division Infantry to struggle against bitter resistance at every step. German forces included Tiger tanks, whose 88mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns couldn't penetrate Tiger armor. The 761st developed compensating tactics, using superior mobility to flank heavier German tanks and exploiting their mechanical reliability to maintain more operational vehicles. Sergeant Frank C. Cochran radioed that his tank had been hit 3 times, but he continued giving the enemy hell. By January 9, 1945, Tillet fell to American forces. The 761st had helped stop the German offensive at heavy cost. February and March 1945 saw the battalion participating in assaults on the Siegfried Line, Germany's final major fortification system. Attachment to the 103rd Infantry Division supported the assault. Within days, the Siegfried Line broke and enemy troops surrendered in increasingly large numbers. By March 23rd, the Black Panthers had destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles and heavy weapons, inflicted 4,000 casualties, and captured nearly as many prisoners. Combat conditions differed from France and Belgium. Operating on German soil, they faced increasingly desperate resistance from Wehrmacht and Volkssturm units defending their homeland. German soldiers began surrendering in larger numbers, particularly upon realizing they faced the black tankers they had heard about. Prisoners were terrified of capture by black soldiers, believing through their own propaganda that they could expect no mercy from such savages. The 761st learned to remain inside their tank hatches until Germans approached closely, preventing surrendering troops from seeing their skin color, which would cause them to howl in terror and flee. This fear, entirely based on Nazi propaganda depicting black soldiers as savage and merciless, proved completely unfounded. The battalion treated prisoners according to Geneva Convention protocols, frequently sharing their own rations with captured Germans. As the unit crossed into Germany proper during March 1945, they encountered scenes revealing the true nature of the regime they fought. German civilians, conditioned by years of racial propaganda, were terrified of the black soldiers. Many fled rather than remain in areas the 761st occupied. The battalion maintained strict discipline nonetheless. No reprisals occurred against civilians, no looting, no revenge attacks, despite the racial hatred they knew these people had been taught. This professional conduct confused German civilians who had expected racial inferiors to behave like the savages depicted in Nazi propaganda. Tank battles continued as the battalion pushed deeper into Germany. They faced panthers, tigers, and desperate resistance from SS units. Warren G. H. Creasy, who had earned his Iron Man nickname, proved particularly notable during this period. He frequently dismounted his tank at night with an M1 Garand rifle to conduct personal reconnaissance missions. One of the most profound moments in the unit's combat history occurred between May 4th and 5th, 1945. A grimmer encounter took place on May 2nd when the tankers liberated Gunskirchen concentration camp in Austria, discovering approximately 15,000 Hungarian Jews near death from starvation. The scene confronting the black tankers defied description. Thousands of skeletal figures, many unable to stand, filled the camp. SS guards had fled days earlier, abandoning prisoners to die. Technician 5th grade Johnny Stevens later recalled seeing people who looked like skeletons attempting to smile and wave. Some cried. The tankers gave everything they had, including rations and chocolate. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Nazi Germany's supposed racial inferiors were liberating victims of racial hatred. One woman liberated by the unit, 17-year-old Sonia Schreiber-Weitz, described her rescuer in the poem The Black Messiah. She wrote of a black GI standing by the door, someone she had never seen before. She thought he must be the Messiah come to set her free before she died. By late April 1945, the 761 became one of the first United States battalions to meet Soviet forces. The meeting occurred at Steyr, Austria, in early May 1945. Sources vary between April 26th and May 5th to 6th. Tanker Leonard Smith received the shock of his life when a stout Russian woman tanker approached him shouting, "America, America, America," then embraced him in a tight hug until he could hardly breathe. Soviet forces, including female tank crews, showed no surprise at seeing black American tankers. For them, what mattered was that these were fellow soldiers who had survived the brutal fight against Nazi Germany. The battalion's combat record speaks for itself. 183 consecutive days of combat, from November 7th, 1944 to May 6th, 1945. 6 countries traversed, including France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. 4 major campaigns comprising northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes-Alsace, and Central Europe. Approximately 4,000 German casualties inflicted per National World War II museum records. German equipment destroyed included hundreds of vehicles, 31 pillboxes, 49 machine gun emplacements, and 29 anti-tank guns captured. Unit casualties approached 50%. Initial strength consisted of 36 officers, 30 black and 6 white, plus 676 enlisted men. 71 tanks lost total. Awards included 1 Medal of Honor posthumously to Reuben Rivers in 1997, 7 Silver Stars, 70 Bronze Stars, and approximately 246 to 300 Purple Hearts. While specific Wehrmacht documents mentioning the 761st by designation remain limited, German reactions to black American troops are well documented in military archives and prisoner interrogations. One surrendering German officer asked how many Negro Panzer divisions existed. When told only 1 battalion, he refused to believe it. The continuous presence of the unit over 183 days had created the impression of a much larger force. German prisoners repeatedly expressed surprise at the combat effectiveness of black troops. Interrogation reports from 1945, now housed in the United States National Archives, show German soldiers struggling to reconcile what they witnessed with what they had been taught about racial superiority. One captured Wehrmacht sergeant told interrogators they were told Negroes would run at the first shot. Instead, they kept coming even when their tanks were knocked out. This wasn't what they expected. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but the unit's fight was far from over. Like their white comrades, African American tankers struggled with memories and in some cases post-traumatic stress. Unlike white soldiers, black soldiers dealt with segregation and the often savage racial prejudice characteristic of this period in American history. Texas Native Staff Sergeant Floyd Dade Jr. described the contradictions for black soldiers returning to the United States in an oral history, saying they didn't have equal rights and democracy was against them. The men who had destroyed German tanks and liberated concentration camps returned to an America where they couldn't eat in many restaurants, had to sit in the back of buses, and faced violent racism. German prisoners of war held in the United States were often treated better than the black soldiers who had captured them. For 33 years, the battalion's achievements went officially unrecognized at the unit level. Individual medals were awarded, but the Presidential Unit citation that white battalions received immediately was denied. Not until January 24, 1978, did President Jimmy Carter award the Presidential Unit citation to the unit. The citation read in part that the 761st Tank Battalion distinguished itself by extraordinary gallantry, courage, professionalism, and high esprit de corps displayed in accomplishing unusually difficult and hazardous operations. Ultimate recognition came in 1997 when 7 battalion members, including Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, posthumously received the Medal of Honor. Not until over 50 years later, on January 12, 1997, was the Medal of Honor finally bestowed on Platoon Sergeant Reuben Rivers. President Clinton noted at the ceremony that no African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for World War II service received it during the war. One of the most interesting transformations involved General Patton himself. Despite initial skepticism about black soldiers, Patton's assessment changed dramatically through their service. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German soldiers who had raided American warehouses were reported to have disguised themselves as Americans guarding checkpoints to ambush American soldiers, Patton solved this problem by ordering black soldiers, including the 761st, to guard the checkpoints. He gave orders to shoot any white soldiers at checkpoints who acted suspiciously. This order demonstrated remarkable trust. Patton literally placed his entire army security in the hands of black soldiers he had once doubted could think fast enough for armoured warfare. By war's end, Patton had recommended the unit for numerous commendations. While his personal racial views remained complex and problematic, his military assessment of the battalion was unequivocal. They were among his best units. Ironically, the racism that kept the battalion training for 2 years instead of the standard few months became their greatest advantage. The men trained for almost 2 years, conscious that white units were being sent overseas after much less training. This extensive training meant that when they finally entered combat, they were possibly the best prepared tank battalion in the United States Army. They could perform maintenance in complete darkness, had memorized every aspect of their tank's operation, and had developed unit cohesion that only comes from extensive time together. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates later testified that the delay in sending them to combat, which was wrong and racist, accidentally created the best trained tank battalion in the Army. They could do things with Shermans that shouldn't have been possible. While Reuben Rivers received the most recognition, Warren G. H. Creasy's story deserves special attention. Known as Iron Man, Creasy survived the entire war despite being wounded multiple times and destroying extraordinary amounts of German equipment. During one engagement, German fire knocked out Creasy's tank. Instead of withdrawing, he took control of a .50 caliber machine gun on a half-track and used it to cover his crew's escape while destroying the German position. He frequently volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, leading reconnaissance missions on foot behind enemy lines. Creasy survived the war, but like many veterans, struggled with what would now be recognized as PTSD. He rarely spoke about his experiences, and not until the 1978 Presidential Unit citation did his extraordinary service receive proper recognition. One aspect of the unit's service that surprised German forces was their mechanical proficiency. Nazi propaganda had insisted black soldiers couldn't operate complex machinery. Instead, they maintained one of the highest operational readiness rates in the Third Army. This resulted partly from their extended training, but also from the dedication of men like technician 5th grade William Harvey, who could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. The battalion's maintenance crews worked through nights, often under fire, to keep tanks running. German reports expressed bewilderment at seeing damaged Sherman tanks they thought were permanently destroyed return to battle within days. The unit's ability to maintain vehicles under combat conditions exceeded that of many veteran Wehrmacht units. Facing superior German tanks like Tigers and Panthers, the battalion developed innovative tactics. The Sherman's 75mm gun often couldn't penetrate the frontal armour of German heavy tanks, so they perfected flanking manoeuvres they called cat hunting. One Sherman would act as bait, drawing fire and revealing the German position. Two others would then race to flanking positions, targeting the thinner side and rear armour. This required extraordinary coordination and courage. The bait tank was often destroyed. These tactics were studied and adopted by other American armoured units. The unit's combat innovations contributed to overall improvement of American armoured doctrine in the European theatre. During the Battle of the Bulge, they played a crucial role in relieving the encircled 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. While Patton's relief of Bastogne is well known, the role of the 761 is often overlooked. Fighting through terrible winter conditions with temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, the battalion helped punch through German lines. They faced not just regular Wehrmacht, but also SS units, making desperate attempts to maintain the encirclement. The 101st Airborne, surrounded and running low on everything, watched as the battalion's Shermans broke through German lines. One paratrooper later recalled they didn't care what colour the tankers were. They were the most beautiful sight they'd ever seen. The unit produced exceptional combat leaders. Captain Erwin McHenry, Captain John Long and Lieutenant Charles Barber all demonstrated tactical brilliance under fire. These black officers commanded not through formal military hierarchy, but through earned respect and demonstrated competence. Captain David Williams, who commanded Company A, submitted more Medal of Honor recommendations for his men than any other company commander in the battalion. Most were downgraded or ignored due to racial prejudice, only being properly recognized decades later. Success came partly from exceptional cooperation with infantry units. Despite initial prejudice from white infantry units, the tankers' combat performance quickly earned respect. During the assault on Klimbach, France, white infantrymen specifically requested their support, having seen their effectiveness in previous engagements. The battalion's consistent willingness to provide close support, often at great risk, saved countless infantry lives. One infantry sergeant wrote home that the coloured tank boys saved their bacon more times than he could count. They'd drive right into German fire to provide cover. He didn't care what anyone said about them. The aggressive combat style was reflected in ammunition consumption. They fired over 300 tons of ammunition during their deployment, an extraordinary amount for a single battalion. This wasn't wasteful shooting, but sustained, accurate fire reflecting their extensive training. German after-action reports frequently noted the accuracy of American tank fire in sectors where the unit operated. As casualties mounted, they faced a unique problem. The segregated army had limited numbers of trained black tank crew replacements. Many new men assigned to join the Black Panthers were raw and untrained or, being rejects from other units, totally unfit for duty. This meant experienced crew members couldn't be rotated out for rest. Exhausted men continued fighting because there was no one to replace them. This contributed to both the extraordinary heroism and the high casualty rate. The presence of the battalion created problems for German propaganda. Soldiers who had faced them couldn't reconcile their experience with official Nazi racial theory. Wehrmacht morale reports from early 1945 note increasing skepticism about racial propaganda among troops who had faced black American units. Soldiers were asking if the racial theory was true. Why were they losing to inferior races? This cognitive dissonance contributed to the collapse of fighting spirit in many German units during the war's final months. Before deployment, they had trained in the American South under Jim Crow conditions. Most black tankers had to train at installations located in southern states such as Kentucky, Louisiana, and Texas. In the days before civil rights advances made in the 1960s, black people were still treated harshly in the South and often considered inferior by white residents. At Camp Hood, Texas, they faced constant racial harassment. Local businesses refused to serve them. Military buses were segregated. The battalion was housed in the worst part of the base near the sewage treatment plant. Yet this adversity forged extraordinary unity. The men knew they were fighting two wars, one against the Germans and another against racism. This dual purpose gave them a determination that German forces couldn't understand or overcome. The most famous member was First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt, Jackie Robinson. During training, a white bus driver told Robinson to move to the back of the bus. Robinson refused and was arrested. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates refused to consider the court-martial charges put forward by the arresting military policeman. The post commander transferred Robinson to the 758th Tank Battalion, whose commander was willing to sign the insubordination court-martial order. Robinson was court-martialed but acquitted on all charges. However, the legal proceedings meant he missed the unit's deployment. He received an honourable discharge in November 1944 and would go on to break baseball's colour barrier in 1947. On November 10, 2005, a monument to the battalion was unveiled at Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos, Texas. The monument features 4 black granite tablets surrounding a life-size marble sculpture of a battalion fighter kneeling atop a black granite pedestal engraved with a tank on the front and a panther on the back. The dedication was attended by surviving veterans, their families, and military officials. The keynote speaker noted that they had fought not just for victory over Nazi Germany, but for the principle that all Americans, regardless of race, could serve their country with distinction. Perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. In the 1990s, American military historians interviewing former Wehrmacht veterans about tank warfare encountered consistent mentions of exceptional American tank units. When asked to identify these units, German veterans frequently described the black tankers who had fought with particular ferocity and skill. These were men who had no reason to praise their former enemies, yet they consistently identified the unit as among the best tank units they had faced. One former German tank commander stated simply they fought like devils. They couldn't understand why men their own country treated as inferior fought so hard for it. Now he thought perhaps that was why. They had something to prove, and they proved it. The human cost of service was severe. With nearly 50% casualties, the battalion paid a heavy price for their achievements. Families received telegrams informing them that their sons, husbands, and fathers had died fighting for a country that didn't grant them full citizenship rights. Yet survivors rarely expressed bitterness about this contradiction. Leonard Smith, who became a New York City transit officer after the war, said in a 1995 interview they knew what they were fighting for was bigger than the prejudice they faced. They were fighting for what America could be, not what it was. For decades, their story was largely unknown outside the black community. History books, when they mentioned black soldiers at all, typically focused on support units. The combat achievements of units like this were minimized or ignored. This began to change in the 1970s with the civil rights movement's emphasis on recovering black history. The 1978 Presidential Unit Citation brought national attention. The 1997 Medal of Honor ceremony brought even more. Today, the 761st Tank Battalion is recognized as one of the most effective armored units in the European theater. Their story is taught at the United States Army Armor School, studied at military academies, and honored in museums. The story remains relevant today. It demonstrates that prejudice and discrimination waste human potential. The Army's initial reluctance to use black soldiers in combat roles nearly deprived it of one of its best tank battalions. It also shows that excellence cannot be suppressed by prejudice. Despite facing discrimination from their own country and deadly hatred from their enemies, the men achieved extraordinary things through skill, courage, and determination. Their story challenges us to examine our own prejudices and preconceptions. If Nazi Germany, one of history's most militarily proficient nations, could be so catastrophically wrong about racial capabilities, what assumptions do we make today that might be equally false? The combat record became a powerful argument for military integration. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, desegregating the armed forces, the combat achievements of units like the 761st were specifically cited as evidence that segregation weakened military effectiveness. During the Korean War, integrated units performed exceptionally well, validating this decision. Many veterans served as advisors during this integration process, sharing lessons learned from their unique experience. Individual veterans faced varied post-war experiences. Some, like E.G. McConnell, used the GI Bill to get college educations that would have been impossible before the war. Others faced continued discrimination in employment and housing despite their service. Warren Creasy struggled with PTSD, then called combat fatigue, for years after the war. Like many veterans, he rarely spoke about his experiences. Not until the 1978 Presidential Unit Citation did many families learn the full extent of their relatives' heroism. The full story has been pieced together from various sources, including official army records, German military archives, personal letters and diaries, and oral histories collected decades later. Each source adds details to the picture of extraordinary service under impossible circumstances. The United States Army's official history, published in the 1950s, barely mentioned them. It took independent historians and the veterans themselves to ensure their story was preserved. Today, the National Archives holds extensive records of the battalion's service, available to researchers and the public. The liberation of Gunskirchen concentration camp is commemorated at Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims. Survivors and their descendants have maintained connections with battalion veterans and their families. In 2015, the Austrian government invited surviving members to ceremonies marking the 70th anniversary of the war's end. They were honoured not just as liberators, but as men who had shown humanity in the midst of inhuman circumstances. The German Tigers and Panthers never expected the Black Panthers to fight at all, much less to fight for 183 consecutive days without relief. Nazi racial ideology had assured them that black soldiers were incapable of operating tanks, lacking in courage, and would flee at first contact. Instead, they encountered men who had trained longer, fought harder, and endured more than almost any other American unit. They didn't just help defeat Nazi Germany. They demolished its racial ideology through undeniable combat excellence. From the time they entered combat until the end of the war in Europe, the men received 7 Silver Stars, 246 Purple Hearts, and 1 Congressional Medal of Honor. These decorations, many awarded decades late due to racial prejudice, only hint at the full extent of their heroism. The battalion fought for 183 days without relief, not because they weren't exhausted. They were. Not because they didn't suffer casualties. They lost nearly half their men. They fought because they carried the hopes and dignity of millions of black Americans who were told they weren't good enough to serve their country in combat. Every Sherman tank they drove into battle carried more than ammunition. It carried the weight of representation, the burden of proof, and the determination to demonstrate that courage and competence know no colour. Every German position they destroyed struck a blow not just against the Wehrmacht, but against the racial prejudices of two nations, their enemies and their own. The German forces that faced them learned a lesson that challenged everything they had been taught. The black soldiers they had been told were subhuman proved to be extraordinary humans. The inferior troops demonstrated superior courage. The men who shouldn't have been able to operate complex machinery mastered tank warfare at the highest level. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't capturing towns or destroying enemy tanks. It was proving, beyond any doubt, in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, that excellence is not determined by race, but by training, determination, and character. They were the Black Panthers. They came out fighting, and for 183 days without relief, against enemies who never expected them to fight at all, they never stopped. Their legacy lives on, not just in military history, but in the ongoing struggle for equality and recognition that their sacrifice helped advance. The German tigers expected easy prey. They found instead the Black Panthers and learned that everything they believed about race and war was wrong.